Welcome to Curious and Unqualified, a show about life in academia. I'm Eric Edlund, professor of physics.
I'm Jeremy Jimenez, professor in the Foundations and Social Advocacy Department.
Well, Jeremy, what's on your mind tonight?
Just earlier today, I read that Penn State is closing or will be closing several of its branch campuses. There's some debate as to if it's definitely happening, when it's happening, but it certainly seems that something will be happening and some of its campuses will be closing. And of course, this is a phenomena we're seeing all over the country, even before the Trump administration and his assault on higher education. Near where we live, Cazenovia closed, Wells is closed. Ithaca College hasn't closed, but over the COVID period, they, I think, let go maybe up to 180 professors. So what we're seeing is there's several reasons why this is happening, but it's supposedly 2025. This is the peak of college enrollment of what's called the demographic cliff, and the idea that based on birth rates as well as declining college enrollment for different reasons we can discuss, higher ed is in trouble. Higher ed is in trouble having enough students to pay tuition to keep colleges functioning. And so we're at the kind of just the cusp of higher ed as a whole philosophy and movement and industry existing as we know it. So what has been your experience of that enrollment cliff?
Well, we haven't quite experienced it yet. At our institution, there's been a lot of concern and ongoing discussions about the coming demographic cliff this year. And in that sense, there's kind of a sense of urgency that pervades a lot of the discussions on campus right now. I wouldn't say panic, but certainly concern for the future. And this affects me in my job as chair of the physics department, essentially on a daily basis. One of my main jobs right now is thinking about how we can improve our recruitment, improve our retention, and kind of market ourselves better. And so this involves, we're kind of doing the basic stuff at this point, right? Trying to revamp the website, trying to think about how we can reach students better, how we can sell the student experience to prospective students better. And my big worry is that everyone else is having exactly the same thoughts. And effectively, by trying as hard as we can, we're going to be treading water and probably not making much ground. And so I think there's probably something we need to do beyond the basic tasks that we're looking at right now. And I don't know what that is at this point. I don't have that formula, but I have a concern that we're going to see the crunch, we're going to feel the crunch, and we need to, unless we do something really innovative, we're gonna suffer.
Do you in any way sense or fear there could be a race to the bottom where one of the things you can notice across college campuses is like really elaborate student life centers, sometimes with lazy rivers and climbing walls, that in order to attract more students, if you can't attract on intellectual rigor, you attract on the frills of a college campus. But thinking actually of teaching itself, do you have concerns that in order to attract students, there could be more grade inflation, or there could be more pressure to deliver A's so that students will be more likely to choose the campus where they can more easily get the higher grades if it has that reputation? And would you be willing to make changes to your own rigor in order to save your program and arguably save your job?
That is a complicated question that becomes an ethical question as well. I don't know that I have a good answer for you on all of that at this moment, but I am concerned about the issue. You mentioned a race to the bottom. I think that is part of the puzzle that we're looking at. I think that is definitely there. I am also concerned that as we all feel the crunch, and I think it should be noted, you mentioned here that this is like a large-scale phenomenon we're looking at. Maybe you know the numbers better than me, but my kind of recollection is that we're looking at something like nationwide. It's not necessarily a huge change. It's something like on the order of, 3 to 5% decline in the next roughly decade. Mm-hmm. So it's not like it's a cliff nationwide, but there's going to be much more severe consequences. New England, New York are already seeing that and feeling it, and I think we're going to be hit especially hard.
Right, because we have a general population decline.
Yes, yeah, there's an exodus out of New York for one, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, we're going to feel it more strongly here, and I think how I see this playing out locally is that we in the SUNY system are going to be in competition with other SUNY campuses. And we already know this is happening. There's a couple SUNY campuses that have been really hard hit. And one of the things I've heard that some of them are doing are, because their enrollment is so low already, their dorms are, some of them, I don't want to say empty, but they're under enrolled, right? They've been extending offers to students of either free or greatly reduced room and board because, well, they might as well fill up the empty rooms. It's not much extra cost to the college.
And you give a better experience for people in the dorm, right? So it's almost like you're giving a discount so that people will be more likely to want to be there because there's more of a life there.
Exactly, yeah. So we're seeing institutions make concessions like that. And then as students become a more scarce resource, we're going to see institutions like the more premier institutions, the SUNY Binghamtons, the SUNY Albanys, the SUNY Stony Brooks, right, start to suck up more of the available student population that maybe wouldn't have gone there and maybe would have gone to one of the other kind of intermediate campuses. And so I think we're going to start to feel the competition from the big SUNY campuses more strongly.
Yeah, and for us, for the short to medium term, because most of the students in my department and most of the students in my school are planning to be teachers, there's a bit of an inelastic demand for that because, currently for most public school teaching jobs, you need to be certified in the state of New York, and the clearest way to do that is through a formal teacher education program such as ours. And although there has been certainly declines in teacher enrollment and teacher ed programs, there is still a base need for teachers, and that's temporarily sheltered us. But even we have been noticing certainly smaller numbers every year. And concerning is we heard recently that SUNY Albany is planning on expanding their education program, right? So there's even this kind of, like you mentioned, competition within schools where if education is one of the ways you can help buttress and keep your numbers higher, more schools might be tempted to invest in those, but then those will then be pulling students from the existing programs. So it's not, I know you've told me some experiences you've had, and many professor friends of mine in many different contexts have told me about they ran to the dean and the dean brought up, so what are you going to do to get your numbers up, right? So that hasn't yet happened to us, but I do think looking down the road, we might start to have those pressures.
Yeah, there is some of that pressure already. I think it's been in a number of the conversations with in the chairs meetings, just kind of a regular conversation about enrollment and outreach. So I don't want to say that it's exactly pressure, but the message is there, right? That this is something we need to and should be thinking about. Kind of related to all this is the growth of online programs.
Sure.
And I think there's at least one program in the School of Education that is essentially completely or largely online.
The literacy, in our school, the literacy program.
Yeah, what's your feeling on online education at this point? Is this a thing that we should be investing in? Is this a good way to go? And you could look at good in two ways. Is it a good strategic investment just for the sake of enrollment and funding? And is it actually good in terms of education?
On the former, I would say clearly yes, especially while I think there's still a general preference for an in-person experience at the undergraduate level, for the master's level, I think there's a bit of a shift. Maybe it's because people are doing their master's part-time, or they don't want to have to travel as much, or the idea of living on a campus or near a campus is no longer desirable, or they already have families, etc.
Well, especially for the teachers. A lot of students leave, go off, start a teaching job, and then in New York State, they're required, at least previously were required to get a master's degree, I think within 5 years.
Yeah, that's still, there's been talk about removing that requirement, which of course has those of us in teacher ed programs concerned, but that's, I believe, temporarily on hold for now. But it certainly at any moment could.
But the point being that that population of people has already left college and they're off. They've started their life and their career. Right. So it makes sense, I think, to want to do an online program and not have to step back and go back to college full time again.
Yeah, so I think if you're looking at the bottom line and budgets, and of course there's less overhead costs, right, for online programs as well. students are often using their own computer, right? They're not even using.
You don't need a classroom.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
So I think for budget and keeping, your tuition up and your students there, it makes total sense. Pedagogically, I can't say I'm a fan.
So we all had this experience in the pandemic
Right.
period, right? Spring 2020, students were forced to go home. Fall 2020, a good fraction of our classes were online.
Yeah, I think we were kind of unique. I don't know how many other schools had this where we as professors, they gave us a choice. Do you want to teach in person, socially distanced, wearing a mask, or do you want to teach fully online? And then eventually it was required everyone had to be in person. But I was one of the very few, I don't know what the numbers were, but I mean, looking at the empty classrooms, if I had a ballpark estimate it, maybe like 15 to 20% chose to teach in person.
Yeah, there was a lot of panic during that period. Yeah. I mean, and I get part of that. I think it was, in retrospect, panic.
I would agree.
Yeah. I was with you.
As someone who was teaching in person.
Yeah, I love teaching in person. I had to teach online because I was teaching a large enrollment class. I think they set a cap. I forget what it was. If it was above 60 or 70, then you had to be online because they just didn't want that many bodies together.
Right.
So at that point, I was teaching a larger enrollment class and had to go through that. But otherwise, I chose, in person.
Yeah, I understand there are obviously certainly convenience, and there are some pedagogical benefits to online teaching for accessibility, for people who can't as easily travel, the affordances of technology, everywhere you can access that. But in my experience, it's just too easy to be distracted, to not pay attention. I mean, I can't. As dynamic as I would try to make it, there was also the issue of, do you force a student to show their camera? But then there's equity issues there, right? Because, you might be forcing them to show you a window into their home, which is their private home. And what if, they don't have the same wealth as their peers and that gets exposed, right? So there's all these reasons why.
Well, that's why you have the fake backgrounds.
Right.
You can be like in the Versailles palace or whatever.
Sure, but so there's a lot of students, if they didn't have their camera on, there's a good chance they would literally walk away, right? They would just kind of or fall asleep or play video games, but even if they did have their cameras on, they might be looking like they're paying attention, but they're actually just watching something else, else on another open window. And again, I don't, there were obviously one of the things I thought was kind of interesting and unique was I used GroupMe a lot for discussions at the time. And it was just a way in which you could give a question prompt. And what was kind of nice is that more people did respond because there wasn't the pressure of people who were willing to share their point of view, but can't articulate it quick enough in a way that they're comfortable doing it. They are comfortable typing it out. And especially if it's no rush, you can give a question prompt and then people can have several minutes to respond. So I would say more people did respond in discussions, but my whole point is that especially for our students, their teachers, it's an in-person job where you're forming in-person relationships and they need that exposure and experience of that in-person environment to prepare them to be teachers. And that I think was very much lost to not have that. So in short, I would say I understand the budget reasons, but I sure lament it as what gets lost, not having that kind of personal and the spontaneity, right? There's kind of spontaneous conversations that just kind of happen before, during, or after class. But on an online, I think it's basically okay, class is over, boom, the class is shut down, as opposed to a student lingering to chat about something they thought was interesting for 15, 20 minutes.
For sure, yeah, you can't form those personal connections. It's hard to joke with the student. I the other day told a student in class that I said to him, that was a dumb question. Only because he and I have established a very good relationship, and he's doing research with me. I hold him in very high esteem, and he knows this, and that's the kind of thing that I can say to him.
Because you've had that time to
in good humor in the class.
Well, yeah, so I think online is one of the ways colleges are addressing it. But it's important to say that the decline is not just lower birth rates and people moving to the region. There are other reasons why college is seen as less desirable, and I think that's also worth discussing. So some things I would say are that the college degree is being questioned, right? Because many more students are going into much more debt to pay for their degrees, and the professional jobs are not paying as much when they get out of college, especially with regard to the amount of debt they have. So I think in general, some people are finding it less desirable because they don't see the economic calculus as working out. I also think there's a lot of demonization going on even before the recent election, right? Of just like the college place being liberal indoctrination zones. And so that's turned people against what's happening at colleges and wanting to be in the college setting. There's a crisis of male enrollment. Every year, the numbers of females increasingly outweigh the number of males enrolled in college classes. And I think there's different reasons for that. There's perhaps could go to learning differences between how boys and girls are taught at a younger age. And that's kind of carrying up the chain where education and schooling and traditional learning is not desirable as desirable to boys compared to girls as it was in the past. And so yeah, there's a lot of these challenges. Immigration, where the stricter rules against students enrolling in college. Students is not being protected, where we previously had the DACA, where students could be protected enrolled in college. Those protections are eroding. So there's a whole lot of factors pushing people away from college, and there's not a whole lot to draw them in, at least vis-a-vis a generation or two ago.
You mentioned a bunch of interesting things there, and I think maybe in a later podcast we can come back to the topic of the male enrollment decline and differences in education and upbringing there, because I think one aspect of that's really interesting is that despite the general decrease in male enrollment, you still find very strong disciplinary trends.
Yeah, right.
The sciences, especially physics, chemistry, engineering disciplines, things like economics, mathematics, still heavily male-dominated, despite decades of effort to try to draw more women into this. And it's actually largely, from what I've seen in the data, stagnated. So I think there's a lot we could discuss there. But another factor I wanted to mention, too, is that in addition to all these things, you also have outspoken popular critics of college,
right?
Questioning the value of a college education. Right, you have examples, people like Mark Zuckerberg, who is famous for dropping out of Harvard and becoming a billionaire. Elon Musk, who openly declares, kind of along the lines, that you mentioned, that college is not worth it. It's largely indoctrination. Right, so people hear these messages, they see these examples of successful people without college degrees, and I think, in a sense, rightfully so. Like if you are an intelligent, hardworking person, you can get very far in this world. And so I think part of that is actually very reasonable. I think we have probably largely, as a society, come to put too much value on a college degree to the point that it becomes essentially a hoop to jump through. Oh, you want an administrative position that doesn't require a lot of skill? You need a college degree. Right. I mean, you can be filtered out in the job process.
Oh, and that actually would be another one of those pressures, in that a lot of the, even companies like Google have in recent years sort of saying, we're not going to require that anymore.
Well, when they're hiring high school kids with excellent programming skills, right, it kind of sends the message, maybe you don't actually need a college degree.
Yeah. And I'll even say, as someone invested in higher ed, and part of it, there's certain groupthink that goes on about, not questioning how colleges. I mean, the fundamental structure of the university is centuries old. It goes, arguably 800 years old, right? I mean, obviously it's changed since the University of Paris, but not a whole lot when you think about a lot of the ways, the structure and courses and requirements.
Yeah, they didn't have a lazy river and a climbing
wall. They didn't, no. Although they did have, at the time, they're actually called the Wandering Scholars. There was kind of interesting time that if you wanted to have, the crazy college party life was actually available to you in the 12th, 13th, 14th century, especially because if you got in any kind of trouble for drunkenness or fights, you were under church law, which was less strict than state law. And so it was actually this time for college kids to get away and, have a wild time, even, many centuries ago. So those things too are honestly haven't changed all that much.
At this little town where I work in Germany on occasion, there's a very old institution there going back to, I think, the 1400s. And it's quite interesting to take a tour of some of the older buildings there. In one of the buildings, they have a spiral staircase going up, and off to the side are a couple prison cells. If you got caught drinking or being out past curfew, they would literally take you and lock you up in a cell at the college, and you'd have to spend the night there or something. So times have changed.
Is there something we can do differently in colleges besides just lower our standards and besides offer more lazy rivers? Is there a way we can make college more desirable to more people? And what are some of those ways we can respond, either individually within our own classes, institutionally, more broadly?
That's a good question. I think there has been a long history of individual professors trying to innovate and make their classes more engaging and more interesting to students. And I'm not admonishing that. I think that is a great personal objective to continue to work on. I don't think that's the answer to our large-scale predicament here. My feeling is that we're at a time when we need to, or there's an opportunity. I don't know that we need to. I think the traditional college experience is going to continue to exist, but I think there's a ripe opportunity out here for someone to reinvent the college experience. If I could wave my wand and come up with a new institution, I would probably largely cut out general education. I think it's a pretty antiquated idea. I don't personally feel that it should go, but I think the market is demanding kind of more efficiency and a more tailored, focused experience. And I think if we could do that, that would be something that would maybe draw people in.
Yeah, I think the theory and philosophy behind the general education, I am a fan of, exposure to different ways of thinking and different disciplines, etc. But in practice, right, if it's not high quality teaching in these courses, and I know how even as an advisor, they're often, I'll hear other advisors say like, oh, just knock out your general eds, right? So there is often this sense of like, oh, this burdensome chore I have to do and take these classes I don't want to take. I want to be deep diving into my field already, whether it be education or physics, etc. And so, I think there is something to be said about the value of being forced to be exposed to different ideas. If there's not high quality instruction or the students are not perceiving it to be a worthwhile learning experience, then it is just more of a bureaucratic time suck, which of course does go back to the idea of enrollment, right? Because if by forcing more students to take classes, you're protecting jobs for people who teach those general eds who otherwise not find their programs enrolled.
I agree with that completely. And look, if you actually wanted to do general education, you could do it in a reinvented way. I could design a whole physics curriculum, right, that would bring in world history. Like, I would love to develop a course on engineering and science in the ancient world.
Yeah.
Right there is like, I could have a whole general education program built around physics and engineering, right? If I was given the freedom to do that. The problem is, I think institutions are in a hard spot right now, especially a lot of state colleges. And the idea of radical innovation is scary to administrators. And there's very much a sense from administrators that they want us to do what other institutions are doing, right?
Right.
And I'm a little
especially
disappointed.
When the leaders have more resources,
Yeah, exactly. On the other hand, I get it because resources are limited and you want to make wise decisions.
And those disciplinary limitations are really strong. I used to do a lot of work with history and social studies and digital technology, and I would find often that I would be like, okay, I could either present this at a technology conference or at a history conference. And I present it at the history conference or the history section, and then I get rejected. You should really submit this to technology. It's a much better fit there. And then I go to submit over to technology, like, oh, you really should submit this to history. It's a much better fit there. And so, there are the significant disciplinary limitations to this architecture and art of the ancient world and engineering, right, that I would love to take. And I would love to take those courses. And, so I think some of it is we're hired as disciplines, right? Most of us get PhDs in our disciplines, so the whole structure is there. But it would be nice if, especially you would think, if there's hiring freezes due to budget, that could be a chance to kind of shuffle around what is currently existing there. But of course, this is a little tricky for us being part of a state university system, right? Because any changes we make, we actually have to go through the whole state system.
Oh yeah, there's a lot of red tape, and there's a lot of discussion in government right now about cutting regulations and making government more efficient. And I don't necessarily agree with all of that, but working for effectively the state government, I see the red tape and the bureaucracy, and it's awful and demoralizing. Your good ideas get squashed in paperwork.
Although I think one of the great benefits of tenure is the freedom you get when you have that sort of job security. And so I think the more professors acknowledge this problem and know something needs to be done to make it more engaging, to keep people, keep students wanting to come to college, especially if more of them are concluding that they don't think they need to for their careers, or they don't think they want to, it's not worth the cost. Tenure provides us that capacity to innovate and to experiment and to combine classes and work with other professors and do things together. And so I hope this is a conversation for all those who are in higher education, once you've passed that bar of tenure, to use it as a chance to experiment.
Well, if anything, it's going the other direction. Like, one of the things that's happening now is there's the state and the federal governments are mandating that we give much more oversight and scrutiny to which classes students take for students who are on financial aid. Mm-hmm. Because should they deviate outside the kind of the
4-year
program,
structure,
right? Then any extra classes they might take might not be covered. And this is just such a stupid bean counting philosophy. It's like, man, you might have students who are really here wanting, they loving education and wanting to learn. Maybe they want to take, a sculpture class, or maybe they want to take a world history class. And, they're a physics student, maybe they're already done with their general education, and they want to just expand their knowledge. They can't do that anymore.
Right.
It's not fulfilling a requirement. They can't even get a minor in many cases, because the student financial aid will only cover a single primary major.
Right, exactly. And whatever you can complete in the required 4 years, right?
Right.
Yeah, I did 5 years undergraduate. Yeah,
I mean, it was 6.
Yeah,
I did 2 years at a community college and then a full 4 years of college afterwards. When I was done, I had something like 220 credit hours because I was taking Latin and metaphysics
you loved,
and all sorts of
you loved
things.
the college experience. You loved learning. And
I had a great time. And look, an easy fix. If anybody in state government is listening to this, do us a favor. Just raise the limit of funded credit hours to 150. Give students some room to make a mistake and repeat classes or change majors, or just explore and have a bit of fun.
And if the colleges are under...
That's not abuse, and that's not criminal.
Right, and if there's under-enrollment anyway, there's empty seats in classrooms, and you're helping also professors keep their jobs, right? So, you would benefit by having students stay in school an additional semester a year if they want to stay in school or need to stay in school.
And the fact that this is happening makes me wonder if there is a perception amongst many in government that this is part of their responsibility to fight fraud and inefficiency.
Or slacking off, or the perception that it could be almost like a prejudiced assumption of the students who are eligible for free college because of their parents' income. It's kind of like this micromanaging, and assuming you must not be a responsible person that can make good choices, understanding your learning. We're gonna kind of paternalistically make sure and monitor you to make sure you finish in 4 years.
I don't even know. I mean, on one hand, I think it is a responsibility of our stewards in government to make sure that our tax dollars are used efficiently, within reason, and that we should always have an eye out for corruption and misuse of funds. That's all reasonable to do, but you got to balance that with just tedious bean counting in the end that just makes people's lives hell.
So we discussed some ways we can mitigate this. But what's your looking in the crystal ball to the future? Do you imagine that if you so desire, you will be able to retire in your late 60s from your current job?
Will my job be around in 20 years?
Right.
Gosh, I feel like the future is really foggy. I have no idea on that, to be honest. Our enrollment in physics is not great, and I hope that it's kind of turning around at this point, and we're going to have some better times to come, but it could easily turn again. I mean, I feel it's like the stock market, right? You see a little blip up and you get excited, but then the next day it crashes. So who knows what the coming years bring. That being said, I guess I'm kind of mentally preparing myself for the eventuality that maybe I'll have to go shopping around to industrial companies here to find a job. And I'd be okay with that. I'm not going to hit the panic button here.
Well, I guess, I have I don't know exactly my own careers, accessibility, and availability 20 years from now. But the long-term trend, I would say is most higher education institutions will be functioning as we know them within a few decades, and not anything to do with demographics or the enrollment crisis or the assault on higher ed. Well, those are all contributing factors, but simply environmental and access to fossil fuels, right? Like, how are people able to attend a college? They're able to attend a college because they have gas to drive them from their home to the campus. They have this whole massive infrastructure of buildings and digital technology and internet and staff and all the people driving from all over the place to get to work. That will be fading away eventually, without making a specific timetable prediction of that. Like, eventually the gas and the oil will be too expensive to provide the common amenities and usage of driving, etc., as we're accustomed to them today, and will inevitably make all places more local. I'd be very interesting to know what higher education looks like in its twilight years, right? Like, once we see the enrollment going down and most people can't afford it because gas is too expensive, maybe we return to a model where I would actually love it if students went away to college in late August and then only went home for the holidays in December and then went again home in summer because it was too expensive to regularly travel back and forth. And they actually get this really in-depth learning experience where they don't just, when they have a bad week in class, they flee home to be with their friends and family. They actually know that you sit with it, you deal with your loneliness, you deal with that, you build community. Because I think that, a problem a lot of places suffer is it's hard to build that community if you constantly have an out, right? You have a lever out of campus to not deal with issues of alienation and loneliness you might experience. And so then of course I imagine too, as more people are aware of the severity of our energy and environmental predicaments, that will start to shape what we're learning. And
in your mind, this is something you see as likely happening in the next couple of decades. The end is nigh.
Yes. Again, it's really hard to know. Oil-producing countries are really good at hiding how many oil reserves they have, for their investors. And climate and other environmental issues, most of them consistently show to be worse than previously predicted, to always be worse than the model suggests, suggesting we're in for more hardship and more revenue is getting diverted to deal with these various ecological crises. So it's interesting point for me is I see that as the end point. All these things we were discussing previous to this were things that are accelerating or catalysts or things that might contribute to the downfall higher to the absence of an energy environmental issues. But fundamentally, the energy environmental issues will lead to the collapse of higher education as we know it. And so that's why I also see my own role as kind of like a shepherd through that transition and shepherding the institutions as well to their twilight days. That's a message I haven't found to be too popular or resonating yet. But again, I feel like every year I say these things, there's a few more people that will kind of nod and be like, yeah, I kind of see where you're coming from.
I can see where you're coming from in that. And I don't share the same belief or expectation about the collapse, but I kind of long for that same outcome. I think life would be better in many ways if it was more local and things were simpler. I love just the basic chalk talk at the board. Like literally a piece of chalk in my hands and a blackboard. I'm happy as can be. I don't need any projector or anything else. Let's just talk it out here.
Yeah, no.
So the more we could do that, the more we could build stuff with our hands. Learn, that's a skill too, right? The more we could actually just have classes and experiences built around using tools and making things, which I think would probably fit with your philosophy as well, in terms of a life skill.
No, and the thing I struggle most with, especially as I'm in a department in which disability studies has a strong feature, is I have come to understand that there are a lot of ways in which digital technology provides affordances for learners with disabilities to have access to learning they might not otherwise have, right? So on one hand, I fully recognize, the ability to have the text appear at the bottom of the screen, things like that are clearly beneficial. But I don't believe those technologies will be around for so much longer. And so the kind of tension I experience is acknowledging their value and wanting to make them available for students who benefit from them so they're not excluded from education. But seeing the writing on the wall that the day is coming eventually when those technologies will not be available for anyone. And so to what extent do you make them available while you can? But I think the most ethical responsibility to do is, if you're aware of the energy environmental predicaments involved in these technologies, is to use them with a hospice mentality. They're here now, let's use them. Understand, though, they're going away, and to not build a dependence on them. And that's, of course, a whole other issue is even outside of issues of disability studies, dependence on technology and dependence on smartphones being a very terrifying thing that I think we all increasingly see, not just on college campuses, not just with young people, but people of all ages.
Yeah. It sounds like there could be a whole interesting field of research there about how you can make education more accessible in the absence of technology.
Yeah.
Right. Which probably people deal with in third world countries.
Oh, exactly. And I think that's exactly the point, is that let's have those conversations now, right? To scaffold that future when those technologies aren't available. So people aren't just left hanging like, oh, I learned how to do these things with this technology. What do I do now? And that's awareness of the predicament approaching for the, whether you want to use the word collapse or not, the simplifying or the great humbling, as Dougald Hines would call it. That is our future, and we would do well to serve students to help them understand that. And
well, we started this conversation off with talking about the demographic cliff affecting colleges in particular, and maybe the bigger issue is the civilization cliff that Jeremy thinks we're coming up against, and the demographic cliff will just be a drop in the bucket.
A blip, a blip by the fireside chats.
Exactly. Well, I think I dodged your earlier question about my ethical responsibility.
Well, that's all right. Well, we can. There's several topics here, especially with technology, that we can certainly explore in future episodes.
Indeed. Well, that was a good conversation. Thank you, Jeremy.
As always, Brother Edlund.
All right. If anyone listening to this has comments or thoughts or things you'd like us to explore on a later podcast, please drop those in the comments. Thank you.
Have a good day.